February 23, 1944, 22:17 hours. Occupied Netherlands, 12 miles southeast of Amsterdam. The winter air at 20,000 feet carried a cold so absolute it seemed to penetrate aluminum and leather, seeping into bone despite layers of wool and sheepskin. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber pressed his gloved hands against the control column of his Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter, feeling the aircraft respond with the precision that 2 years of nocturnal hunting had made instinctive. Through the armored glass canopy, the darkness below revealed nothing. No city lights, no vehicle headlamps, no sign that millions of people lived beneath the blackness. Occupied Europe had learned to hide from the bombers, extinguishing every light that might guide RAF pathfinders to their targets. But Weber did not hunt by sight alone. The green glow of the Liechtenstein radar scope, mounted between him and his radar operator, Feldwebel Klaus Richter, painted the night in phosphorescent lines and blips that transformed invisible sky into readable geometry. Richter hunched over the scope, his face bathed in that spectral light, calling out ranges and bearings in the clipped monotone of a man who had conducted this dance hundreds of times. The scope showed a contact, a single aircraft heavy by its radar return flying west at 18,000 feet. An RAF bomber returning from a raid, perhaps damaged, certainly alone and vulnerable. Weber's radio crackled with the familiar voice of his ground controller, Hauptmann Ernst Hoffmann, transmitting from the Himmelbett station designated Löwe 3, Lion 3. Nachtjäger 24, contact confirmed, bearing 280, distance 8 km, altitude 5500, vector 290, prepare for intercept. Night Fighter 24, contact confirmed, bearing 280, distance 8 km, altitude 5500, vector 290, prepare for intercept. The instructions carried the routine authority of a system that had been refined through thousands of engagements. A technological symphony where ground-based radar, airborne radar, and radio communication combined to transform German night fighters from blind hunters into guided executioners. Weber acknowledged the transmission and turned to the new heading, his engine settling into the steady drone that had become the soundtrack of his war. Around him, the night pressed in with a weight that was almost physical. He had flown 127 combat sorties, had witnessed the deaths of friends, had killed enemies whose faces he never saw, just silhouettes in darkness, aircraft that became fireballs before tumbling toward the earth below. The war had been going on long enough that such thoughts no longer disturbed his sleep. This was simply what he did, what he had been trained to do, what duty demanded. What Weber could not know, what no German pilot flying that night could comprehend, was that the voice he trusted, the system he relied upon, the technological superiority he assumed was unassailable, had already been compromised. That 300 miles away in southern England, in an underground operations room hidden beneath the Sussex countryside, a young woman with headphones and a microphone was listening to his controller's transmissions and preparing to do something that violated every established doctrine about intelligence operations. That in moments she would press her transmission key and speak, in perfect German with flawless accent and procedural correctness, directly into the radio network that Weber believed was secure. That she would give him instructions that sounded exactly like his controller's voice, would vector him away from his target using words he had been trained since flight school to obey without question. The gamble was desperate and dangerous. If it succeeded, it would save dozens of RAF crews from the lethal precision of German night fighters. If it failed, it would expose Britain's most critical intelligence capability and likely result in her court-martial. But Flight Officer Joan Miller had studied the intercepts, had analyzed the patterns, had listened to hundreds of hours of German radio traffic until she could think in their language and speak with their authority. She knew that the Luftwaffe's sophisticated air defense network had one vulnerability more fundamental than any technical weakness. It was built on absolute trust between ground controllers and pilots. Trust that anyone speaking on secure frequencies with proper procedures was legitimate. Trust that could be weaponized by someone who understood how authority sounded in German. She pressed the transmission key and spoke. With the bored precision of a controller who had vectored 1,000 intercepts, she gave Weber instructions that would send him hunting empty sky while the RAF bomber he was stalking escaped into the darkness. The voice in his headset was crisp, professional, indistinguishable from the dozens of controllers he had worked with across 2 years of night fighting. He had no reason to doubt it, no reason to question. Every instinct, every training drill, every successful engagement had taught him that the voice of ground control was the voice of tactical certainty. He turned to the new heading, throttling back as instructed, climbing to an altitude where nothing waited but stars and freezing air, and somewhere over the North Sea, an RAF Lancaster heavy bomber limped homeward, with battle damage and a crew who would never know that a woman's voice speaking German from England had just saved their lives. To understand the audacity of what Joan Miller was attempting, one must first grasp the technological arms race that had transformed the night sky over Europe from a realm of relative safety into a lethal chessboard where detection meant death. When Britain's strategic bombing campaign began in earnest in 1940, darkness offered sanctuary. Bomber crews flew under cover of night, relying on blackness to hide them from German fighters and anti-aircraft batteries. The Luftwaffe possessed capable night fighters, twin-engine Messerschmitts and Junkers, but without effective means of locating bombers in darkness. These aircraft were reduced to flying standing patrols and hoping for visual contact on moonlit nights or near burning cities. The interception rate hovered around 2 to 3%. For RAF Bomber Command, night missions were dangerous but survivable. The equilibrium shattered when German engineers deployed the Kammhuber line, named after General Josef Kammhuber, architect of the Luftwaffe's night fighter force. The system divided German-controlled airspace into a grid of overlapping radar zones, each monitored by a ground station equipped with both Freya early warning radar and Würzburg precision tracking radar. These Himmelbett stations, the name meant canopy bed describing the grid pattern on planning maps, could track both incoming bombers and defending fighters simultaneously. Ground controllers at each station would vector night fighters to intercept positions with methodical precision, guiding them through each turn and altitude change until the fighter's own airborne radar could acquire the target. The transformation in German night fighter effectiveness was catastrophic for Bomber Command. Loss rates on night missions climbed from 3% to 7%, then to 10% on raids into heavily defended areas. Aircrew calculated their survival odds with grim mathematics. At a 10% loss rate per mission, a crew had less than a 35% chance of surviving a standard 30-mission tour. The Bomber Boys gave themselves dark nicknames. Bomber Command's elite became the Doomed. They wrote letters before each mission, said goodbyes that were never explicitly final, and developed the black humor of men who had accepted that death was more probable than survival. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, who would later lead the famous Dams raid, described the psychological weight in his memoir. We flew knowing that German controllers were watching us on radar scopes. That night, fighters were being vectored to intercept us with mechanical precision, that the darkness which we thought protected us had become transparent to their technology. Every minute over enemy territory felt like flying through a gauntlet, where unseen hunters had every advantage. The boys dealt with it differently. Some became fatalistic, some superstitious, some simply numb. But we all understood we were fighting an enemy that could see in the dark while we remained blind. British intelligence had known about the Kammhuber line since late 1941, when RAF photo reconnaissance aircraft captured images of the distinctive radar installations dotting the European coastline. They understood the basic operational concept, ground-controlled intercepts using radar tracking. But understanding a system and countering it were different challenges entirely. RAF scientists developed countermeasures. Window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to saturate German radar screens with false returns. Mandrel, airborne jamming equipment that attempted to blind German early warning radars. Tactical innovations like the bomber stream, concentrating aircraft to overwhelm the capacity of individual Himmelbett stations. These countermeasures reduced losses but did not eliminate the fundamental problem. German night fighters were still finding and killing RAF bombers with disturbing efficiency, and by 1943, the Luftwaffe had refined their system further. The introduction of Liechtenstein airborne radar gave German fighters the ability to track targets independently once they were within a few kilometers. New tactics allowed fighters to infiltrate bomber streams and conduct multiple attacks before British crews even knew they were being hunted. Controller procedures became more sophisticated, with sector commands coordinating multiple Himmelbett stations to hand off tracking responsibilities. As bombers flew across zone boundaries, The human element of this technological system was what caught the attention of Y Service. Analysts like Joan Miller, I Service, the British Signals Intelligence Organization responsible for intercepting and analyzing enemy radio communications, had been monitoring German night fighter frequencies since 1941. The intercepts revealed a system of remarkable efficiency and equally remarkable vulnerability. German ground controllers directed fighters using standardized radio procedures, speaking clearly and professionally with minimal encryption. The Luftwaffe had assumed their tactical frequencies were secure, simply because British forces could not know which frequencies would be used on any given night and did not have German-speaking operators monitoring them in real time. Both assumptions were wrong. By 1943, British listening stations had catalogued the frequency ranges used by various Himmelbett stations and could identify which stations were active on any given night within minutes of operations commencing. More significantly, Y Service had recruited dozens of German-speaking operators, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany or Austria, fluent native speakers who could not only translate but understand the nuances and regional accents that colored military radio traffic. Joan Miller was among the best of them. Born in Berlin in 1918 to a British diplomat father and German mother, she had lived in Germany until 1936, when her family returned to Britain. She spoke German as a native, could identify regional dialects, understood the cultural context of military hierarchy and procedure. For 2 years, Miller sat in underground listening posts wearing heavy headphones that pressed against her ears until they ached, transcribing German radio traffic by hand in notebooks that were immediately classified. She listened to ground controllers vector fighters to kills, heard the professional satisfaction in their voices when pilots reported target destroyed that transcribed the coordinates and call signs and tactical procedures that built a comprehensive picture of how the Himmelbett system operated, and gradually, she began to understand that the system's greatest strength was also its most profound weakness. The Luftwaffe's night fighter network functioned because pilots trusted their controllers absolutely. A pilot flying blind in darkness at 300 miles per hour had no way to verify the vectors and instructions coming through his headset. He could see nothing. His radar scope showed only contacts without context, and his survival depended on trusting that the voice guiding him was competent and correct. This trust was reinforced through training, through successful missions, through the military culture of following orders without question. German controllers spoke with clipped authority, used standardized phraseology, followed established procedures. Pilots had been conditioned through thousands of hours to respond to that voice pattern with immediate obedience. Miller's insight was simple and revolutionary. If she could replicate that voice pattern, speak German with the right accent, use the correct procedures, match the emotional tone of professional military communications, she could give German pilots false instructions, and they would follow them. Not because they were stupid or careless, but because every instinct and training drill told them to trust the voice of authority coming through their radio. She could send fighters chasing empty sky, vector them away from bomber streams, give them altitudes and headings that ensured they would never make contact. And unless the Germans realized immediately that their frequencies were being infiltrated, they would have no way to distinguish her false instructions from legitimate controller traffic. The proposal she submitted to her commanding officer in January 1944 was radical enough that it was initially rejected out of hand. The objections were substantial and legitimate. Broadcasting false instructions into German tactical frequencies would immediately reveal to the Luftwaffe that Britain was monitoring their communications in real time. It would force them to change procedures, implement authentication codes, perhaps develop more secure radio systems that would shut down the intelligence windfall that Y Service intercepts provided. The principle of intelligence work was that capabilities should be protected, even at the cost of tactical opportunities. You did not expose your sources just to win a single battle. But Miller's counterargument was equally compelling. RAF bomber crews were dying at unsustainable rates, and the Kammhuber line was the primary cause. Intelligence that could not be operationalized to save lives was an academic exercise, and her analysis suggested that the psychological impact of communications deception could be more devastating than the tactical impact of individual intercepts. If German pilots began to distrust their controllers, If they started questioning instructions, if the seamless coordination between ground and air began to fracture, the entire integrated air defense system would degrade. The Himmelbett network was not just technology, it was technology plus trust plus procedure. Destroy the trust, and the system would collapse regardless of how sophisticated the radar equipment was. Group Captain Michael Forrester, commanding RAFY service operations in the southern sector, read Miller's proposal with the exhausted pragmatism of an officer who had attended too many funerals and written too many condolence letters. The loss statistics were undeniable. The strategic bombing campaign was central to Britain's war effort, and Bomber Command was hemorrhaging experienced crews faster than training commands could replace them. If Miller's gamble failed, they would lose an intelligence source. If they did nothing, they would continue losing bombers and the men who flew them. The calculus was brutal but clear. On February 15, 1944, Forrester authorized a limited trial. Miller would be permitted to make false transmissions during 1 week of operations, targeting specific Himmelbett stations and attempting to divert German fighters away from RAF bomber streams. The trial would be immediately terminated if there was any indication the Germans had detected the deception and modified their procedures. If British aircraft were lost due to her transmissions giving away tactical information, she would face immediate court-martial. The weight of lives would rest on her voice, her accent, her ability to sound like someone she was not. The preparation consumed every waking hour. Miller studied transcripts of intercepted controller transmissions, memorizing phraseology and voice patterns. She practiced with native German speakers who role-played as pilots, challenging her pronunciation and testing whether her instructions sounded procedurally correct. She learned the standard call signs, the typical vector formats, the altitude designations, and distance measurements that German controllers used. Her colleague, squadron leader Peter Dancy, a linguistic specialist who had grown up in Hamburg, conducted brutal practice sessions where he would interrupt her transmissions with questions and challenges, training her to respond with the bored confidence of a controller who had vectored 1,000 intercepts. "You cannot sound uncertain," Dancy instructed. "The moment there is hesitation or confusion in your voice, German pilots will question the instruction. Controllers who sound like they know exactly what they are doing get obeyed. Controllers who sound uncertain get challenged. You need to be so procedurally perfect, so emotionally neutral, that there is no reason for anyone to doubt you are exactly who you sound like. A Luftwaffe ground controller, doing a job they have done 1,000 times before." The first operational transmission was scheduled for the night of February 23, 1944, during a major RAF bomber raid targeting industrial sites in the Ruhr Valley. Intelligence indicated that multiple Himmelbett stations along the Dutch and Belgian coast would be active, with dozens of night fighters airborne. The operational plan was methodical. Monitor German tactical frequencies. Identify when controllers were vectoring fighters toward RAF bombers based on their position reports and intercept geometries. Then transmit false vectors that would send the German fighters to wrong altitudes or headings, breaking the intercept before it could succeed. Miller sat at her radio console in the underground operations room, a reinforced bunker buried beneath 30 feet of earth and concrete in the Sussex countryside. The room was cramped and warm despite the February cold outside, heated by the radio equipment and the bodies of 24 operators monitoring various frequencies. A large plotting table dominated the center of the room, where intelligence officers moved colored markers representing estimated positions of both RAF bomber streams and German fighter activity based on radio intercepts and radar reports from British early warning stations. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, electrical equipment, and the faint dampness that characterized all underground facilities. Miller wore heavy headphones that covered her ears completely, the padding warm against her skin. In front of her sat the transmitter, a standard military radio set modified to broadcast on German tactical frequencies. A single red button would activate the transmission. A microphone hung from an articulated arm, positioned 6 inches from her face. Her notebook lay open, filled with frequencies, call signs, and the standard phraseology she had memorized. At 22 hours, German radio traffic increased dramatically. Multiple Himmelbett stations came on the air, their controllers beginning the night's work of vectoring fighters toward the RAF bomber streams that were forming over the North Sea. Miller tracked the transmissions in her notebook, identifying stations by their call signs and cataloging the frequencies they were using. Lova Dry was active. Lion 3, the Himmelbett station southeast of Amsterdam. So was Tiger 7, Bear 5, and Panther 9. The familiar voices of controllers she had been listening to for months filled her headphones, professional and methodical, giving vectors and altitudes with the routine efficiency of men conducting business as usual. 20 minutes into the operation, she heard what she had been waiting for. Hauptmann Hoffmann, the controller at Löwe Dry, transmitted to one of his fighters. Nachtjäger 24, contact confirmed, bearing 280, distance 8 km, altitude 5500, vector 290, prepare for intercept. The geometry was clear. A German fighter was being guided toward a bomber. The vectors would bring them together in approximately 4 minutes, and if the intercept succeeded, an RAF crew would die. Miller looked at Group Captain Forrester, who stood beside her console with his arms crossed, his face showing no expression. He nodded once. She pressed the red transmission button, feeling it click beneath her thumb, and spoke in German with the flat professional tone of a controller who had done this 10,000 times. Nachtjäger 24, belay last vector. Contact is decoy. Climb to altitude 6000, turn heading Dreh 20, priority target bearing Dreh 5, distance 12 km. The transmission lasted 6 seconds. She released the button. The operations room was absolutely silent. Every operator watching her console, waiting to see if the German pilot would acknowledge, if the real controller would challenge the false instruction, if the entire gamble would succeed or collapse in those first critical moments. 8 seconds passed. Then Oberleutnant Weber's voice came through her headphones, acknowledging the instruction with crisp military precision. Nachtjäger 24 verstanden, climbing to 6,000 meters, turning heading 320. The fighter was following her vectors, climbing away from the bomber, turning toward empty sky where no target existed. 4 seconds later, Hauptmann Hoffmann's voice returned to the frequency, and there was something different in his tone. Not quite alarm, but confusion, the sound of a man whose tactical picture had just been disrupted. Nachtjäger 24, confirm your position. Previous vector remains valid. Miller transmitted again, speaking over the real controller, her voice cutting through his. Nachtjäger 24. Ignore previous transmission. Frequency interference from adjacent sector. Maintain present heading. Contact strength increasing. Estimate visual range in 2 Minuten. She was doing 2 things simultaneously. Jamming the real controller by transmitting while he spoke. Using the physics of radio propagation that gave advantage to the stronger signal, and feeding the pilot exactly what he wanted to hear. That he was closing on a target. That visual acquisition was imminent. That the mission was progressing exactly as doctrine prescribed. The pilot would want to believe the voice telling him success was moments away. He would want to disregard the contradicting voice telling him to reverse course. Hoffmann tried to transmit again, his voice now carrying clear frustration. Nachtjäger 24, this is Löwe Dry control, you are ordered to... But Miller was already speaking, her voice calm and authoritative. Nachtjäger 24. Contact now at visual range, 1 kilometer, slightly below, confirm tally. 30 seconds of silence followed. Then Weber's voice, confused and frustrated. Nachtjäger 24, negative contact, no visual, request updated vectors. Miller did not respond. She let Hoffmann re-establish control, listening as the frustrated controller attempted to give new vectors to relocate the bomber. That was now 15 kilometers away and climbing. The intercept had been broken. The RAF bomber, call sign Charlie Baker 529, a Lancaster heavy bomber from 97 Squadron returning from Hamburg with battle damage and 2 wounded crew members, continued westward toward England, unaware that death had been turned aside by a voice speaking German from 300 miles away. Group Captain Forrester squeezed her shoulder. Again, he said quietly. There are 8 more intercepts developing across the sector. Over the next 5 hours, Miller made 43 false transmissions into German night fighter networks. The success rate was not perfect. Several times, German controllers immediately challenged her instructions and pilots disregarded them. Twice, technical issues with overlapping frequencies rendered her transmissions garbled. Once, a particularly alert pilot questioned why he was receiving vectors from a voice he did not recognize, forcing Miller to abort that deception. But in 31 separate instances, German night fighters were successfully diverted from intercept courses, sent to wrong altitudes, vectored toward empty sectors of sky, or confused sufficiently that successful engagement became impossible. The tactical impact was measurable and immediate. Of the 427 RAF bombers dispatched that night, 19 were lost to all causes, a loss rate of 4.4%, significantly below the 7 to 10% losses that had been typical for recent raids into Germany. Intelligence analysts reviewing the German radio traffic intercepted additional evidence of success. Multiple controllers expressed confusion about radar contacts that disappeared, questioned whether their equipment was malfunctioning, requested technical inspections of their radar systems. The invisible foundation of trust on which the Himmelbett system rested was beginning to crack. But the more profound impact was psychological, and it unfolded over the subsequent weeks as Miller's operation, now designated Operation Aspirin in official documents, expanded beyond the initial trial. Group Captain Forrester authorized continued false transmissions, with Miller and 3 other German-speaking Y service officers rotating shifts across multiple operations rooms. The Luftwaffe's response provided a window into the disintegration of a system built on trust. German controllers began challenging their own pilots' position reports, uncertain whether the transmissions they were hearing were legitimate. Pilots began questioning controller instructions, sometimes refusing vectors that seemed tactically wrong. The tight coordination between ground and air began to fray as confirmation and counter-confirmation procedures were improvised in real time. The crisp efficiency that had made the Kammhuber line so lethal degraded into something more hesitant, more uncertain, more prone to human doubt. An intercepted transmission from March 2, 1944, captured the erosion. A German pilot, vectored toward a bomber by his controller, transmitted, "Loa 7, request authentication. Last week this frequency was compromised. I will not follow vectors without confirmation from sector command." The controller's response carried audible frustration. "Authentication is not procedure. You are ordered to comply with vectors immediately." The pilot's answer revealed how completely trust had collapsed. "Negative Loa 7, I have responsibility. For this aircraft and crew, I will not follow instructions that may be false." The intercept was abandoned, not because the technology failed or the tactics were wrong, but because the pilot no longer trusted the voice in his headset. This psychological fracture cascaded through the entire Luftwaffe night fighter force. Kill rates declined precipitously. In February 1944, before Operation Aspirin began, German night fighters had destroyed an average of 38 RAF bombers per 1,000 bomber sorties. By April 1944, that rate had fallen to 22 per 1,000. The decline could not be attributed to any single factor. RAF electronic countermeasures had improved. Tactical procedures had evolved. German radar effectiveness had degraded as stations were bombed. But post-war Luftwaffe analyses identified communications deception as a critical contributor to the collapse in effectiveness. General Major Josef Schmid, commanding the Luftwaffe's 12. Fliegerkorps responsible for night fighter operations, wrote in a March 1944 memorandum that was captured by Allied forces in 1945. "The enemy has succeeded in infiltrating our tactical radio networks with false instructions that are indistinguishable from legitimate controller traffic. Pilots report receiving contradictory vectors, multiple voices claiming to be ground control, instructions that lead them away from contacts rather than toward them. We have attempted to implement authentication procedures, but these slow response times to the point where intercepts fail due to delay rather than deception. The fundamental problem is that our system requires absolute trust between controllers and pilots, and that trust has been weaponized against us. We are losing not because our technology is inferior, but because our procedures assume a secure communications environment that no longer exists." The German response evolved through increasingly desperate measures, each revealing new vulnerabilities. They implemented code words that controllers and pilots were supposed to exchange, but the codes followed predictable patterns that British cryptographers broke within days. They shifted to different frequency ranges, forcing Y service to spend several nights relocating them, but the operational pause was temporary. Some controllers began using regional dialects or personal recognition phrases, which only reduced the number of pilots who would accept their instructions. The Luftwaffe even experimented with having pilots question any vector that seemed tactically wrong, which gave individual pilots veto authority over controller instructions and effectively dismantled the centralized control that made the system work. Squadron leader Dancy, who had trained Miller in deception techniques, wrote an analysis in April 1944 that captured the strategic significance. We have discovered that sophisticated military systems are ultimately vulnerable to their human elements. The Germans built an air defense network that integrated radar, radio, and tactics into a formidable whole. But it only worked because humans trusted other humans, because pilots believed that voices speaking with authority were legitimate, because the social infrastructure of military hierarchy created assumptions we could exploit. Technology cannot solve this vulnerability. You cannot build a radio system that is both responsive enough for tactical operations and secure enough to prevent infiltration by someone who speaks the language and knows the procedures. The Germans must choose between speed and security, and in combat, speed is survival. We have forced them into a dilemma with no good solution. The symbolic weight of Operation Aspirin became, unexpectedly, a sound, the distinctive hiss and crackle of a radio transmission beginning, that half-second of static before a voice emerged from the speaker. For German night fighter pilots flying missions after March 1944, that sound evolved from routine background into a source of anxiety. Every transmission could be legitimate orders or enemy deception. Every vector could lead to a kill or into empty sky. The technology that had given them advantage, the radio link to ground controllers who could see the larger tactical picture, had been turned into a weapon of psychological warfare. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Jabs, one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring night fighter aces with 50 victories, described the evolution in his post-war memoir. Before the British infiltrated our frequencies, I trusted my controller absolutely. When he gave vectors, I followed them without question, because he had radar showing him things I could not see. But after the false transmissions began, every instruction became suspect. Was this my actual controller, or was it a British operator, speaking German from England? The voice sounded right, the procedures were correct, but how could I know? I began verifying everything, asking for confirmation, sometimes refusing vectors that felt wrong. This made me slower, less responsive, less effective. Some nights I would hear two voices claiming to be my controller, giving contradictory instructions, and I had no way to determine which was real. The British had found our weakness. We had built a system that worked only if pilots trusted their controllers, and they had made that trust impossible. The radio crackle became, for RAF bomber crews, an inadvertent symbol of the invisible hand that was protecting them. They did not know about Operation Aspirin. It remained classified throughout the war and for decades afterward. But they noticed that German night fighter attacks, which had been terrifyingly effective in late 1943, became less frequent and less successful through 1944. Bomber crews developed their own mythologies to explain the change. Some believed improved electronic countermeasures had blinded German radar. Others attributed it to Allied fighters gradually winning air superiority. A few speculated that German pilot quality was declining as experienced crews were killed and replaced with inadequately trained replacements. All these factors contributed, but the radio crackle, the invisible psychological warfare being conducted by Y service operators speaking German into enemy frequencies, was among the most significant. Flight Lieutenant Dennis Steiner, a Lancaster E. navigator who completed 32 missions between January and July 1944, captured the bomber crew perspective in his diary. We know the Germans are trying to find us every night. We hear their fighters sometimes, see the tracers when they attack other aircraft in the stream. But something has changed since winter. The attacks seem less coordinated, The Germans seem to break off more quickly. We survive missions that should have been fatal. We call it luck, but it feels like something more, like someone is watching over us, turning aside the hunters through some means we do not understand. Whatever it is, we are grateful. Every mission we survive is one mission closer to tour completion, one step closer to going home. The human cost of Operation Aspirin's success appeared in the letters and diaries of German night fighter pilots, documents that were captured, preserved, and eventually released decades after the war. These sources reveal men who understood they were losing not because they lacked courage or skill, but because the system they depended on had been compromised in a way that could not be fixed through better tactics or improved technology. Oberfeldwebel Werner Backe, a radar operator with 43 confirmed kills, wrote to his wife in April 1944, "The English have found a way to speak to our pilots using our own radio networks, giving false instructions that sound exactly like legitimate control. How do you fight an enemy who can impersonate your own commanders? How do you trust your radio when you know the voice might be deception? I fly every mission now with the knowledge that my most sophisticated equipment, the radar, the radio, the connection to ground control might be used against me. We are being defeated not by superior aircraft or more skilled pilots, but by psychological warfare that makes us doubt our own systems." The moral weight of Operation Aspirin troubled some of the Y service operators who participated in it, speaking lies into enemy radio networks, sending pilots hunting empty sky, exploiting the trust that military systems required. These actions were effective but ethically ambiguous in ways that troubled people trained to think of warfare as combat between warriors rather than psychological manipulation of human vulnerabilities. Flight Officer Miller herself wrestled with these questions in letters to her family that were preserved after her death in 1998. In a letter to her sister dated June 1944, she wrote, "I spend my nights speaking German to German pilots, imitating their controllers, sending them away from British bombers that they are hunting. I am good at it. Good enough that they believe me. Good enough that RAF crews survive because German fighters follow my false instructions. I should feel proud. I am saving British lives through intelligence and deception rather than violence. But I also feel something darker. I am exploiting these German pilots' trust in their system, turning their discipline and obedience into weapons against them. They follow my instructions because they have been trained to trust authority, to obey without question. I am weaponizing the very things that make military organizations function. The Germans I am deceiving are not monsters. They are pilots doing their duty, following orders, trying to survive a war they did not choose. And I'm sending them chasing phantoms, making them doubt their systems, contributing to their defeat through psychological manipulation. I believe in what I am doing. Hitler's Germany must be defeated, and this is how I can contribute to that defeat. But I will never be entirely comfortable with the methods. The strategic validation of aspirin came not from any single dramatic event, but from the cumulative weight of statistical evidence compiled over months. By August 1944, RAF bomber command loss rates had declined to approximately 3% per mission, a return to the levels not seen since before the Kammhuber line became operational. The decline resulted from multiple factors: improved electronic countermeasures, the introduction of long-range escort fighters, the degradation of the Luftwaffe through attrition, the systematic bombing of German radar installations. But operational research studies conducted by RAF analysts concluded that communications deception had contributed an estimated 15–20% reduction in losses, saving approximately 250–300 bombers and 1–750–100 aircrew lives between February and August 1944. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, was briefed on Operation Aspirin in May 1944 and wrote a memorandum to the Chief of the Air Staff. I am informed that Y service operations have successfully infiltrated enemy night fighter control networks and that false instructions broadcast by our operators are contributing materially to reduced loss rates. If this is accurate, and the statistical evidence suggests it is, then we have discovered a form of warfare more effective than bombs or bullets. We are defeating the enemy by making them doubt their own systems. I recommend continuation and expansion of these operations. Every bomber that returned safely because a German pilot followed false vectors instead of legitimate ones as a victory, achieved without firing a shot. The liberation of occupied territories in late 1944 provided physical evidence of Operation Aspirant's impact through captured German documents and post-war interviews with Luftwaffe personnel. Allied intelligence teams advancing through France, Belgium, and Holland discovered Himmelbett station logbooks that recorded the frustration and confusion of ground controllers dealing with communications problems they could not solve. The logbook from the Loa Dry Station, the one that Hauptmann Hoffmann had commanded, contained entries that tracked the disintegration of operational effectiveness. An entry dated March 8, 1944. Read: multiple intercepts failed due to contradictory vectors received by fighters. Pilots report hearing instructions that do not match station transmissions. Request technical inspection of radio equipment to determine source of interference. March 15th. Technical inspection reveals no malfunction. Interference continues. Pilots increasingly reluctant to follow vectors without confirmation. Intercept effectiveness declining. April 3. Sector Command has implemented authentication procedures requiring code word exchange before vectors accepted. This adds approximately 30-45 seconds to each intercept sequence. Multiple contacts lost due to increased response time. System is failing. Post-war interviews with surviving German night fighter pilots revealed the human dimension of this operational collapse. Major Martin Drews, who flew 193 combat missions and survived the war with 52 confirmed victories, described his experience in a 1952 interview. By spring 1944, we had lost confidence in our ground control system, not because the controllers were incompetent, they were highly skilled and dedicated, but because we could no longer trust that the voices on our radio were actually our controllers. The British had learned to impersonate them perfectly. I remember missions where I would hear vectors from what sounded exactly like my regular controller. But something in the instructions would feel wrong. The geometry would not match what I saw on my radar scope, or the bearing would take me away from where I expected the bomber stream to be. Sometimes I would follow these vectors and find nothing. Sometimes I would ignore them and later discover they had been legitimate. The uncertainty was paralyzing. We became slower, more hesitant, less aggressive. The British did not defeat us with superior technology. They defeated us by destroying our trust in our own systems. The psychological transformation extended beyond individual pilots to affect Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. By summer 1944, German night fighter units were operating under modified procedures that essentially dismantled the centralized control that had made the Kammhuber line effective. Pilots were given broader discretion to reject controller instructions that seemed questionable. Some units reverted to freelance hunting tactics where fighters patrolled independently rather than being vectored to specific intercepts. Fighter-to-fighter radio communication increased as pilots began coordinating with each other, rather than relying solely on ground control. These adaptations preserved pilot autonomy, but sacrificed the systematic efficiency that had made German night fighters so lethal in 1943. Generalleutnant Joseph Schmid, in a report filed in July 1944, acknowledged the systemic failure with remarkable candor. The enemy's infiltration of our radio networks has achieved what their electronic countermeasures and tactical innovations could not. It has broken the trust between ground controllers and pilots that our entire defensive system required. We can build better radars, train more pilots, develop new tactics, but we cannot restore the absolute confidence that pilots once had in the voices guiding them through darkness. That confidence was the invisible foundation of our effectiveness, and once destroyed, it cannot be reconstructed. We are now fighting with a system designed for centralized control, but operating with decentralized improvisation. The results speak for themselves. Our kill rates have fallen by nearly half. Our intercept success rate has declined from approximately 60% to less than 30%. And pilot morale suffers from the knowledge that their most sophisticated equipment cannot be trusted. The final symbolic moment came not in victory but in a captured photograph that appeared in classified intelligence summaries in May 1945. The image showed the radio room of a German Himmelbett station, abandoned as Allied forces advanced, the equipment still in place but silent, a headset hanging from a hook on the wall. British intelligence officers who catalogued the site found a note taped to the radio transmitter. written in German by the station's final controller before evacuation. To whoever reads this, we fought with honor and professionalism, but we were defeated by an enemy we could not see or touch. They stole our voices, impersonated our authority, turned our own words against us. We could not trust our radios, could not believe our procedures, could not know if the pilots we guided were hearing our instructions or enemy deceptions. This is how wars are lost, not through lack of courage or equipment, but through the erosion of trust in the systems that enable organized military action. May you never face an enemy who fights this way. The photograph circulated among Y service personnel, eventually reaching Joan Miller in her operations room. She studied it for a long time. The abandoned equipment, the handwritten note with its tone of professional respect, mixed with bitter acknowledgement. She kept a copy of the photograph for the rest of her life, mounted in a frame on her desk, a reminder of what she had accomplished and what it had cost in human terms. In a 1987 interview conducted for the Imperial War Museum's Oral History Project, Miller reflected on Operation Aspirin with the perspective that 43 years had provided. We called it psychological warfare, and that label made it sound sophisticated and strategic. But what we actually did was exploit the most basic human vulnerability, the need to trust the voices of authority, to believe that systems designed to protect you are actually working as intended. German night fighter pilots were brave and skilled, but they had been trained to trust their ground controllers, and we weaponized that trust. I spoke German into their radio networks and sent them hunting empty sky, and they followed my instructions because I sounded like someone they were trained to obey. It was effective. We saved thousands of Allied lives through deception rather than violence. But it was also a form of warfare that troubled me then and troubles me still. We did not defeat the Germans through superior technology or tactics. We defeated them by making them doubt everything, by turning their discipline and obedience into liabilities, by demonstrating that the most sophisticated military system is only as strong as the trust that holds it together. The strategic lessons of Operation Aspirin influenced post-war military, communications development and intelligence doctrine. The vulnerability it had exploited, that radio networks could be infiltrated by anyone with proper equipment, language skills and procedural knowledge, drove decades of research into secure communications, authentication protocols and encrypted voice systems. Modern military radios incorporate multiple layers of security specifically designed to prevent the kind of infiltration that Miller and her colleagues accomplished. Voice authentication, frequency hopping encryption, digital handshaking protocols, all these technologies exist because Operation Aspirin demonstrated that trust alone was insufficient security. But the fundamental human vulnerability remained, evolving rather than disappearing. Intelligence services across the world studied Aspirin as a template for information warfare. The use of deception, communications manipulation, and psychological operations to degrade enemy effectiveness without traditional combat. The techniques evolved from radio transmissions to digital communications, from voice deception to multimedia manipulation, from tactical frequencies to information networks, but the principle remained constant. Sophisticated systems are only as secure as the trust that enables them, and trust can be weaponized by anyone who understands how to sound trustworthy. The human cost appeared in the lives of the participants who carried their experiences through the post-war decades. Joan Miller left military service in 1946, worked briefly for the Foreign Office, then became a teacher of German language and literature. She married, raised 2 children, lived a life that appeared entirely ordinary except for the classified work she had done during 2 years of war. She rarely spoke about Operation Aspirin. It remained officially secret until 1978, and even after declassification, she found it difficult to discuss. In her later years, she suffered from recurring nightmares where she heard German voices calling for help, pilots lost in darkness, following instructions that led them nowhere. Her daughter, in a biography published after Miller's death, wrote, "My mother saved lives through psychological warfare, and she never fully reconciled the contradiction, that she was simultaneously proud of what she accomplished and troubled by how she accomplished it. She understood that war required methods that peacetime morality might condemn, that defeating Nazi Germany justified tactics that seemed manipulative and cruel, but understanding something intellectually is different from accepting it emotionally. She died with the photograph of that abandoned German radio room on her desk, looking at it every day, remembering what her voice had done. The German pilots who survived carried their own scars. Those who learned about Operation Aspirin through post-war historical research reacted with a mixture of respect and resentment. Hans-Joachim Jabs, in his final interview before his death in 2003, acknowledged, "The British fought intelligently. They found a weakness in our system and exploited it ruthlessly. I respect their professionalism even as I wish they had never conceived of such tactics. They turned our discipline against us, made our obedience to authority into a vulnerability. Some of my comrades died because they followed false instructions. Others survived because they learned not to trust anything. Both outcomes were British victories. That is what made Operation Aspirin so devastating. It did not matter whether we believed the false transmissions or not. Belief led us astray, doubt paralyzed us, and either way, the British achieved their objective. It was brilliant and it was terrible, and it changed how I think about warfare, trust, and the vulnerabilities that exist even in the most sophisticated systems. The epilogue unfolds in the silence that follows any war. When participants try to understand what they experienced and what it meant, Operation Aspirin saved an estimated 1,750 to 2,100 Allied aircrew lives between February and August 1944. Young men who completed their tours, returned home, married, raised families, lived decades they would not have lived if German night fighters had found them in the darkness. Most never knew that a woman's voice speaking German from England had turned their hunters aside at critical moments. They attributed their survival to skill, to luck, to the general chaos of war. The invisible hand that had protected them remained invisible. But for those who knew, the Y service operators who made the false transmissions, the intelligence officers who authorized the operation, the bomber crews who were eventually told the classified story, the operation became a parable about the nature of modern warfare. That technology alone does not determine outcomes. That the most sophisticated systems are vulnerable to their human elements. That trust is infrastructure as critical as radar or radio, and once destroyed cannot easily be rebuilt. That sometimes the most effective weapon is not a bomb or bullet but words spoken with authority into a communications network where authority is assumed rather than verified. The radio crackle, that half second of static before a voice emerges from a speaker, became Operation Aspirin's enduring symbol. For German night fighter pilots, it evolved from routine background into a source of dread, a sound that meant uncertainty, potential deception, the erosion of trust in the systems they depended on. For RAF bomber crews, though they did not know the connection, it represented the invisible psychological warfare that was protecting them, the voice in the darkness that was speaking German to German pilots and turning them away from their targets. Air Vice Marshal Edward Addison, who commanded RAF intelligence operations in the final year of the war, wrote in his memoirs, Operation Aspirin demonstrated a truth about warfare that makes it both more sophisticated and more fundamentally human than we often admit. We imagine wars are won through superior technology, better tactics, greater industrial capacity. These things matter. But Operation Aspirin succeeded because someone understood that German night fighter pilots had been trained to trust authority, and that trust could be impersonated by anyone who spoke the right language with the right tone. A young woman sitting in an underground operations room, speaking German into a microphone, saved thousands of lives by understanding human psychology, better than the Germans understood their own vulnerabilities. That is warfare at its most elegant and most troubling. Elegant because it achieved strategic objectives through intelligence rather than violence. Troubling because it exploited the very qualities, discipline, obedience, trust, that enable organized military action. The larger truth that Operation Aspirin illuminated was about the relationship between democracy and authoritarian systems in technological warfare. The Luftwaffe's Himmelbett network was a product of German military culture, hierarchical, disciplined, built on the assumption that subordinates would follow orders without question. This culture created efficiency and coordination, but it also created vulnerability. Pilots who had been trained never to question authority became vulnerable to false authority. A system that worked through absolute trust collapsed when that trust was compromised. The British approach, recruiting civilian specialists like Joan Miller, authorizing unauthorized experimentation, allowing a young flight officer to make operational decisions that affected hundreds of lives, reflected democratic military culture's different strengths and weaknesses. The British system was less efficient, more chaotic, sometimes dangerously improvised. But it was also more adaptive, more willing to try unconventional approaches, more capable of recognizing that a native German speaker with linguistic talent might understand psychological warfare better than senior officers with decades of military experience. Squadron leader Peter Dancy, who had trained Miller in deception techniques, captured this dynamic in a 1976 lecture at the Royal United Services Institute. We defeated the German night fighter force not by building better aircraft, the Luftwaffe had excellent night fighters, and not by developing superior tactics. German controllers were highly professional. We defeated them by creating a system that could adapt faster than theirs could, that could authorize risky experiments, that could empower junior officers to try ideas that violated established doctrine. Operation Aspirin worked because we gave a 26-year-old flight officer permission to try something radical, and she succeeded because she understood language and psychology in ways that technology alone could never achieve. That is the advantage of democratic military culture. It is messy and sometimes inefficient, but it can innovate in ways that rigid hierarchies cannot match. The radio crackle echoes still through military history, a reminder that the most sophisticated weapon can sometimes be simply knowing what to say and when to say it. That trust is infrastructure, invisible but essential, and once destroyed becomes difficult to restore. That modern warfare is fought as much in the psychological realm, in the confidence or doubt that determines whether orders are followed, whether systems are trusted, whether technology can be employed effectively, as in the physical realm of bullets and bombs. Joan Miller's voice, speaking German into enemy radio networks, bending the night to Allied purposes, saving lives through deception rather than destruction, became a symbol of intelligence warfare at its most effective and most morally ambiguous. She demonstrated that you could defeat an enemy not by killing them, but by making them doubt everything, that the most devastating attack might not destroy equipment, but rather erode the trust that makes equipment usable, that sometimes the bravest act is not charging into combat but pressing a transmission key and speaking lies with such conviction that the enemy believes them. Absolutely. The museum at Bletchley Park preserves a recording of one of Miller's transmissions, played through vintage headphones in an exhibit about Y service operations. Visitors hear 4 seconds of audio, a woman's voice speaking crisp German, giving vectors and altitudes with the bored precision of a controller who has done this 10,000 times. The voice sounds utterly convincing, utterly authoritative, utterly ordinary. There is no indication it is British, no hint it is deception, no reason for any German pilot to question it. That ordinariness is the point. Operation Aspirin succeeded not through dramatic heroics, but through the mundane professionalism of someone who could sound exactly like what she was impersonating. The exhibit text explains that this 4-second transmission diverted a German night fighter away from an RAF Lancaster bomber on the night of March 17, 1944, and that the Lancaster's crew, 7 young men from Yorkshire and Lancashire, completed their mission, returned to base, and survived the war. They never knew that a woman speaking German from an underground room in Sussex had saved their lives by sounding so convincingly like a Luftwaffe ground controller that the German pilot hunting them followed her false vectors without question. The recording ends, the headphones fall silent, and visitors walk away understanding something fundamental about modern warfare. That sometimes the most sophisticated weapon is not technology, but psychology, not firepower, but understanding, not violence, but the simple act of speaking with authority to people who have been trained to trust authority. The radio crackle, that half-second before the voice begins, contains within it all the complexity and moral ambiguity of intelligence warfare, all the tension between effectiveness and ethics, all the recognition that defeating an enemy sometimes requires exploiting their virtues rather than their weaknesses. Joan Miller pressed a transmission key and spoke German into the darkness, and the darkness bent to her will. Not through force but through persuasion, not through destruction but through deception, not through superior technology but through superior understanding of how humans trust and doubt and follow and question. She demonstrated that the most dangerous radio gamble was not about equipment or tactics, but about whether one person, speaking the right words in the right tone at the right moment, could make an enemy believe a lie so completely that they would follow it into empty sky while the people they were hunting escaped into the night. The gamble succeeded. The hundreds lived. The voice in the darkness proved stronger than radar and radio, and all the sophisticated technology of industrialized warfare, and the lesson endured. That trust is the invisible foundation on which all military systems rest, and that foundation can be weaponized by anyone who understands how to sound like they belong, how to speak with authority, how to turn the enemy's discipline and training against them through nothing more than words, spoken with conviction into a radio network where no one expected deception, because everyone assumed that voices speaking with proper procedures were necessarily legitimate. The radio crackle echoes still. In that sound lives the memory of a desperate gamble that saved hundreds, the recognition that modern warfare is fought in minds as much as skies, and the enduring truth that sometimes the most effective weapon is simply knowing what to say, and having the courage to say it when everything depends on being believed.